Ladies and gentlemen, this is a course on modern Russian history from the beginning of this century to the present. It is a course about hope and about tragedy. The hope of successive Russian governments to live in a better society, even a utopian one from our perspective, and the tragedy that has attended these visions. At the beginning of the century, Russia was an empire, a multinational empire presided over by a Christian Russian Orthodox Tsar. And it was the belief of this Tsar and of the imperial family that Russian rule was benign and that it could lead to comity amongst the many peoples of the empire. Communism, of course, is about social equality, about the achievement of justice here and now on the earth, and we know a good deal about that from reading histories of the middle of the century, both what it meant in theory and what it meant in practice. And now it seems to me Russia is in search of a new vision, maybe a democratic vision, more likely a nationalist vision, in which some measure of Russia's former greatness would be restored. Those are the hopes. The tragedies are known to us and unknown to us. Tragedy of 1914 to 1917 ended the autocrat, Christian autocrat Nicholas II and his dynasty, 300-year-old dynasty. Communism meant bloodshed that was unparalleled in the course of Russian history, or indeed the history of any modern nation that I'm aware of. And even now, as we contemplate Russia searching for a new path, already we can see the outline, the shade, the limbs of tragedy in the war in Chechnya and in the internal disturbances that mark Russian society today. What are the themes? Those are the themes of our course, and now let me say something about the objectives of the lectures. I want, in the first lectures of this course, to talk about Russian government as it was at the turn of the century. I want to talk about Russian politics, about contending ideologies and political parties, and most especially, I want to talk about communism, about the party organization, about the different visions that communists manifested in this pre-1917 period. Then we will spend a good deal of time talking about the communist experiment under Lenin and Stalin, and I will devote a couple of lectures to the war, the Great War from 1941 to 45, which killed so many Soviet people, the attempts of the regime to reconstruct and reconstitute itself after this war. From 1953 to 1991, and arguably beyond 1991, the Soviet Union experienced de-Stalinization. This is something that some historians think was finished in 1991. I think you could push the argument a little farther and say that even now, in post-communist Russia, efforts to de-Stalinize, to exorcise Stalinist habits of mind and Stalinist culture from the body politic are ongoing. And of course, at the end, I will devote several lectures to Mr. Gorbachev's perestroika reforms and to what we know of the Yeltsin government. This is a course about the Russians, but it is also a course about us. It is about a stake, a historical stake that we have in understanding. Many of us were born in the Cold War generation. All of the adults in this room and in the listening audience know that America expended enormous amounts of capital, trillions of dollars, in the efforts to defend ourselves against the real and perceived communist menace, to contain the Soviet Union and to contain the allies of the Soviet Union. Communism also had a subtle and sometimes startling impact on American culture. We think only of the great African-American novelist Richard Wright, who in the 30s was a member of the Communist Party, and this was an experience that marked his early fiction. So from defense expenditure to our own culture, this is a matter that we have an interest in, and it is one of the justifications of our course that in understanding the Russians and Soviets, we will have a greater measure of self-understanding. Now let me turn to my topic for today. My topic for today is Nicholas II, the imperial government at the turn of the century, and also the social and ethnic difficulties that beset Russian society in this period. Nicholas II came to the throne with the determination that he would rule Russia unwaveringly and unfalteringly in the spirit of his father Alexander II. Nicholas was a Christian autocrat. That is to say, he believed that his office came to him from God himself. And it was Nicholas' determination, like that of every autocrat before him, to pass this office and also the Russia that he inherited on to his heir, full and unchanged. Nicholas was aided in his religious beliefs and in his political determination by his wife Alexandra. Alexandra was born a German princess in the House of Hessen. She was raised a Lutheran. In her house there was a good deal of accent on charitable works and of course on the reading of the Bible. When Nicholas proposed to her, she had a very difficult decision because she could only marry Nicholas if and only if she converted to Russian Orthodoxy. What was it that ultimately sold her on Orthodoxy? It's clear it wasn't the amatory prowess of Nicholas himself. It was elements of the Orthodox religion. She loved Orthodoxy because of its emotiveness. One could manifest emotions in the course of an Orthodox service that would not be shown in the rather staid Lutheran practice of her home. It was a mystical religion. There was a belief in achieving salvation through suffering. Those of you who have read Dostoevsky's novels know that this is a central conceit of the heroes of these novels, but it is a conceit that is drawn out of the Russian Orthodox religious heritage. So Alexandra, when she married Nicholas, when she converted to Orthodoxy, she converted to a religion passionately, with belief, and with such passion and belief that she reinforced the political and religious understandings of her husband. And if you read their correspondence, it is simply full of this, of religious expressions and affection that is rooted in a common belief system. Now, Nicholas came to the throne with certain models of behavior, which he had learned in his youth from the courtiers that taught him. And based on his own wide reading in Russian history, he was a Russian history buff, he chose two Russian czars of the past to model his reign on. The first of these was the 17th century Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich. He was a man so saintly, so devoted to orthodoxy, that Russians of his day referred to him as Alexei Tishaishi, Alexei most gentle. The other autocrat, which Nicholas admired a great deal, had a spirit far different from that of Alexei most gentle, and that is the autocrat Ivan IV, known usually in English as Ivan the Dread or Ivan the Terrible. This was a man who was ferocious in defense of Christian learning, and a man ferocious to his political enemies. In fact, he is a Russian Tsar, one among several, who slayed his own son out of a political disagreement. So Nicholas chose two models for his reign that couldn't be more different. One gentle, one ferocious, and the two models help to explain certain actions at different moments of his reign. Nicholas, for example, when he abdicated the throne, was able to do so with utter equanimity. This is something that was drawn from his emulation, I think, of the saintly Alexei. On the other hand, Nicholas was known to some of his critics as Nicholas the Bloody. He committed Russia twice to great wars, and so this moniker was perhaps very well earned. Behind Nicholas and Alexandra, there stood the authority of the Russian Code of Laws. Article 1 of the Russian Code of Laws specified that, quote, "The Tsar of all the Russias is an autocratic and absolute monarch. God himself commands us to obey the Tsar's supreme authority, not from fear alone, but as a point of conscience." Two additional articles of the Code of Laws, Articles 246 and 248, made it a criminal offense to utter, quote, "impertinent remarks" about the Tsar or about anyone in the royal family. These impertinent remarks were classified by the Code of Laws as blasphemies, that is to say, as religious offenses. So behind the perception of the Tsar that his office rested on sacred authority was a legal writ which said that criticism of His Majesty was in fact a religious offense. Now, outwardly, many Russians manifested to the very end of the old regime, they manifested toward the Tsar an extraordinary deference by modern standards, by Western standards. For example, peasant petitioners who referred to the Tsar in their requests that some grievance be addressed, referred to His Majesty nati, the Russian word meaning thou. This is the same form of address that was typically used by Christians in addressing God in prayer. So the religious deference toward the autocrat and religious deference toward God was one and the same for these common Russians. As late as 1914, the day that Russia's commitment to fight in the World War against Germany and Austria was announced, Nicholas appeared from the balcony of his winter palace on Palace Square, and assembled Russians below him knelt and sang the national anthem, "God Preserve the Tsar." This is, by, I think, our standards, an extraordinary amount of deference. Now, of course, any polity has to have mechanisms to control crime, because there will be offenses, of course, and mechanisms to resolve disagreements amongst citizens. And in an empire as large as Russia, one can imagine the multiplicity of disagreements that there must have been. The imperial government dealt with crime in a number of ways. It relied first and foremost for the adjudication of petty offenses, what we would call misdemeanors, on peasant courts, courts of the common people established in villages based on communal structures. These would take accusations of crime and would deal out punishment without recourse to a more formal system of courts. Serious offenses, what we would call felonious offenses, were dealt with through a very complex system of jurisprudence. Now, people who are new to the study of Russia might not know, but after 1864, it was the right of every citizen accused of a criminal offense to have a jury trial in Russia. And in theory, the judges that presided over this jury trial were life appointees. They were irremovable from office, and so the executive, in theory anyway, couldn't impact on their position by threatening to fire them. In the large cities, there was a legal structure that in some respects resembles our own. For example, workers who were accused of crime in the big cities of the empire, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Kiev, could plead poverty, and they would be provided free of charge by the local bar association an attorney who would represent them in court. Now, this was something that was not mandated by any kind of a Russian constitution, because such a constitution didn't exist at this point. But it was something that in practice from the 1890s on was available to peasant and to worker defendants. Now, more and more frequently after the turn of the century, both in the countryside and in the city, there were serious disputes. Disputes between the peasantry and the nobility in the countryside, disputes between workers and factory owners in the cities. In the countryside, disagreements between peasants and noble landowners sometimes resulted in collective protests by the peasants, and these protests took various forms. Sometimes a form analogous to the industrial strike. Peasants simply refused to work as they were instructed to do by a contract that they had previously signed. They didn't bring in the grain on time on a noble's estate, something like that. And of course, this has very serious economic consequences for the nobility. In other cases, in 1902, 1903, in the southern part of the empire, in the provinces of Kharkov and Poltava, which are part of southern Ukraine, there were more serious manifestations of peasant grievances. On 50 or so estates in that region, landowners were burned out at the turn of the century. Many others felt that for the safety of themselves and their families, they had to flee. And in 1905, 1906, there was a wave of peasant violence, some of it resulting in the actual killing of landowners. This was a part of the revolution of 1905 to 1907. So very serious disputes could happen in the countryside. And in the cities, with the turn of the century and in a rising crescendo up until 1906, there was a wave of strikes, many of them political strikes. The best known example is the strike, the general strike in St. Petersburg, I suppose, in the 1905 revolution. But even before then, 1904, an Orthodox priest by the name of Father Gapon led a group of peasants and workers from various parts of the capital to the center of town in the attempt to present a petition to the Tsar. And these streams of workers, led by Gapon and others, as they approached the palace square, were blocked by police. The few that reached the palace square had the unfortunate experience of being fired upon by soldiers on the 9th of January 1905. This was a terrible incident known in Russian history as Bloody Sunday. So the potential for social antagonism, very serious social antagonism, was always there. How did the Tsar and his regime deal with this potentiality? Well, in order to diffuse cases of potential violence, the regime appointed provincial governors. These were people who were very savvy bureaucrats. They are sometimes portrayed in historical literature as heavy-handed, but in fact, the best historian of these provincial governors, a man called Richard Robbins from New Mexico, has pointed out that they frequently used charm. He refers to their politesse, their ability to confront even an angry crowd and to somehow, by blandishments, diffuse the angry sentiments of the crowds. Of course, as I have already intimated, this kind of attempt to charm potential protesters out of acts of violence did not always work. And in these cases, the Russian government had in its arsenal a variety of means to deal with protest. Let me just briefly outline some of them. In all of the big cities, Warsaw, Odessa, Kiev, St. Petersburg, Moscow, there existed from 1881 on a state of martial law. That is to say that the governor of the city, the municipal governor, had police powers that could be exercised against citizens who were even suspected of being revolutionaries or subversive. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who of course was a very partisan man in these matters, said that the emergency laws of 1881 were the real constitution of Russia all the way down to 1917. There is some truth in that, because those emergency laws that mandated this kind of war condition in the big cities of the Russian Empire did remain in effect until 1917. The Russian government had police agencies of various types that it could use to infiltrate revolutionary organizations, that had the power to open mails, letters sent from Russian citizen to Russian citizen, the Department of Gendarmes, the Department of Police, and the so-called secret police, or Akhrana, were the three main agencies that I'm talking about here. Now, if all of these agencies failed to do their work, then the government could turn to its ultimate defender, and that is the army. In the end, the army was the final guarantor of imperial stability. Now, we cannot leave the subject of the emperor's powers and the nature of the internal regime in Russia without mentioning two additional quivers that were in the emperor's arsenal. The first of these was capital punishment. As in other states in Europe, Russian courts could impose a death penalty by hanging for capital offenses, and it did so when very serious crimes were committed. In 1825, for example, when the so-called Decembrists rebelled and attempted to seize power in St. Petersburg, 5 of the leading rebel conspirators were hanged by the government. After 1881, when Tsar Alexander II was assassinated by revolutionaries in broad daylight in the middle of St. Petersburg, there were another 5 hangings of the miscreants who were responsible for this terrible deed, including, incidentally, one woman. This was a shock that a woman would be hanged by the imperial regime, but Tsar Alexander III, the successor of the slain Alexander II, felt that he had no choice but to mete out this punishment to someone who had killed his father. Sometimes the government sentenced miscreants, subversives, revolutionaries to death, but at the very last minute, it dramatically commuted this death sentence. The most famous example of this occurred in Dostoevsky's life in 1849. Dostoevsky was a member of the so-called Petrashevsky Circle, which is a group of socialists and in some cases of would-be revolutionaries. The leaders of the Petrashevsky Circle were arrested, they were sentenced to death, and they were actually brought to the Senate Square in the middle of Petersburg and told they would be hanged before horses arrived from the emperor, dramatically commuting this death sentence. Now, if we measure by the standards of the Soviet Union, 20th century standards, that's, let's say, in that part of the world, recourse to the death penalty under the czars was relatively infrequent. One authoritative source has calculated that between 1826 and 1925, less than 900 people were hanged in Russia. That is to say, about 11 people a year. During the bloody events of the 1905-1907 revolutions, the government employed capital punishment on a rather larger scale. If you take the first 6 months of 1906, when military tribunals were meting out immediate justice to revolutionaries, there were 950 political offenders that were hanged in that period. But still, I caution, by the standards of the mid-20th century in the Soviet Union, this was a small number of people put to death. The second extra arrow in the government's arsenal was exile and hard labor in Siberia. Now, as prison sentences go, banishment to Siberia was not necessarily that severe a punishment. What it entailed usually was this, that a person convicted of a political crime, those were usually the sorts of people banished, was confined to a given village or small region. Periodically, once a week or once a month, depending on how close the police constabulary was to that place, the criminal would have to report his presence to the authorities. There are very many cases, famous cases, of revolutionaries banished to Siberia who managed to run away, some of them several times running away. So this kind of punishment was not that severe. And incidentally, when Vladimir Ilyich Lenin was banished to Siberia, he managed to write a book during his banishment on the condition of labor. So one could even work under these circumstances at intellectual tasks. Now, prison labor camps were a different matter. Most serious crimes of a political nature resulted in confinement in a hard labor camp. The worst, the most notorious of these hard labor camps at the turn of the century was on the Isle of Sakhalin. This is on the very, very far eastern part of the then Russian Empire. There, people were heavily manacled so that they could not run away, and they were usually shaven, whether they were male or female, in such a manner as to identify them as politicals, so that if they attempted to run away, they would be easily caught and brought back. Anton Chekhov, the great physician, the writer, say one that gave us The Cherry Orchard and Dядя Vanya, visited the Isle of Sakhalin in the 1890s, and he's left a very restrained in its tone, but also very harrowing account of what life was like for the political exiles at that place. So, in short, the Russian government was a religiously conservative government. It relied on the police and the army to suppress dissent. It used on occasion capital punishment, exile, and Siberian hard labor camps. And all of these factors probably explain the impression of some contemporaries, visitors to Russia, and some Russians themselves, that on the turn of the century, Russia was a kind of a monolithic state, an inert state, a Christian state that wouldn't change for a very long time. And yet, these impressions, as we'll see right now, were illusory. They were mistaken. Beneath the placid exterior of Russia. Beneath the peasant kaftans, the colorful blouses of the women's workers' garb in the city, there were seething resentments in people's souls. These resentments were multitudinous, but if we want to classify them, it's a dangerous business for a historian or anyone else to sort out the nature of resentments because they're so complex and sometimes irrational. But if we want to categorize them, it seems to me we can talk about two sorts of resentments. One was the kind of ethnic resentment that was felt by the non-Russian and particularly by the non-Slavic peoples of the empire toward the Russians. And the second kind of resentment, I think, can be called the antagonisms that were created by the growth of the market economy from the late 1880s through 1914. Let's focus for a minute on the first of these kinds of resentments. At the turn of the century, the Russian Empire was an enormous landmass. It comprehended the terrain stretching across two continents, from Poland in Europe all the way to the Pacific, so it was a Euro-Asiatic territory. And in the north, from the Baltic and White Seas to the south in the Black and Caspian Seas. So this is an extraordinary amount of territory. And on this territory there lived, demographers tell us, somewhere between 125 and 130 million people at the turn of the century. Now, of these, 3/4 were Slavs: Russians, Poles, Belarusians, Ukrainians, and some smaller Slavic peoples. Less than half of them were Great Russians. To be more precise, there were about 57 million Great Russians that made up 45% of the imperial population. Most of the Great Russians, the ethnic Great Russians, were concentrated in the central parts of the state, what I would like to call the core of the empire. And around this Great Russian core of the empire were peoples that had generally been conquered by the Russians in the moments of their imperial expansion. If you look in the West, you find communities of other Slavic peoples, about 22 million Ukrainians, about 8 million Poles, roughly 6 million Belarusians at the turn of the century. But the West was also the home of over 1 million Germans, 1 million Baltic peoples, Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians. About 5 million Jews lived in the area known as the Pale of Settlement in the western provinces. So in the West, the ethnic Great Russians were submerged, as it were, in a sea of other Slavs and also non-Slavs. If you look in the South, there were Greeks, there were Turks, Armenians and Georgians, Chechens, Ingusheti, Mingrelians, Ossetians, Tatars, Turkomans, and Uzbeks. In the eastern steppe, there were Kazakhs, Bashkirs, other small nomadic or semi-nomadic tribes. The eastern, far eastern part of the empire, what we call commonly Siberia, was home to dozens of indigenous peoples. And then in the north, there were the Finns. Finland was at this point nominally an independent state, but it was administered under the Russian crown. And there were Finnish minorities living in Russia outside of Finland. So nearly 100 peoples constituted this multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious empire of Russia. Now, how to describe such a government in operation. One way to describe it is as a friend of mine, another historian, did. He called it an improbable monstrosity, something that had just grown up willy-nilly by random. Other people, not so charitable, have called it the prison of nations. And there is some truth in this, because many of these peoples, if they had their preferences, would not have wanted to live under the authority of the Russian czars. Now, let us be fair. Some of the peoples in the empire found it in their calculated best interests to remain under the suzerainty of the Romanovs. This was probably true, for example, of some of people in the Ukraine who were Russian Orthodox. It was probably true of the Belarusians. It was likely true of the Baltic Germans, because they were very well treated in the imperial bureaucracy. They were, in a sense, a more favored people than even great Russians themselves. It is probably true as well of Armenians, because the alternative for the Armenians was too horrible to contemplate. That was namely living under Turkish suzerainty, and one knows what happened to the Armenians that lived there in the great genocidal killings during the First World War. So, some of these smaller peoples certainly appreciated and benefited from Russian rule. And yet, nevertheless, on the whole, there were grave difficulties besetting the administration of Russia in the ethnic area. Let me give you a couple of examples. For example, Jews in the Pale of Settlement. It is well known that they were the subject of many discriminatory laws. After the 1890s, they could not be admitted to the Russian bar. There was a quota placed on Jews as to the number of people that could get a higher education. In the 1890s, Nicholas II himself signed a law which said that Jewish citizens of the empire could not take Christian names. This has an eerie resonance for people in the 20th century who know what happened in Nazi Germany. From time to time, there were terrible deeds that were attributed to the Jews. For example, in 1879, in a southern town called Kutaisi, a Jew was charged with ritual sacrifice of a Christian child. This was so-called blood accusation that was conjured up by local Russian nationalist Christian anti-Semites. This was a charge repeated in 1911 in Kiev in the case of Mendel Bailis, a man who was ultimately acquitted by the Russian courts because the evidence against him was fabricated. There was violence directed by so-called Christians against the Jews. In 1881, in 1903, and 1905, Jews were victimized by Christians in so-called pogroms. These were episodes of violence which were, from the Christian point of view, organized. Christians marked into Jewish quarters of cities, and all sorts of mayhem resulted. So the Jewish population of the empire was filled with fear and a very understandable resentment against the Russians. Or take another flashpoint, this one to the north. I mentioned before the Finns. Up until roughly the end of the 1880s, the Finns were satisfied that their nominal independence was being respected, and their domestic autonomy to make certain rules governing the Finnish population respected enough that they had no serious quarrel with the imperial regime. In fact, Alexander III was rather popular in Finland. But under Nicholas II, after he appointed a governor named Bobrikov in Finland, all of this changed, and changed for the worse. Starting in the mid-90s, there was a series of attempts by Finnish nationalists to reverse disagreeable policies that were put in place by Nicholas and by Governor Bobrikov. In 1899, this is something that is known to Finnish peoples and Finnish historians very well, but it's not very often mentioned, I think, by Russianists. In 1899, over 500,000 Finns, if you could imagine, signed an address and took it to Nicholas II, and the address accused the Tsar of trampling on Finland's historical rights and asked for redress to these grievances. Polish nationalism was a problem. I won't go into detail about that. Poland was also nominally an independent state, but it was from the 80s on administered as a kind of province of the empire, so that the difference between the Polish case and the Finnish case diminishes as we get to the turn of the century. In Poland, Roman Dmowski attempted to organize Polish peoples peaceably against the Russians and worked for first autonomy of a greater nature and then eventual independence. And the man called Pilsudski also organized, although his tactics were more violent and confrontative. So these flashpoints in the Pale of Settlement in Finland and Poland suggested that there were powerful tensions between the non-Russian peoples of the empire and the Russians in the core of the empire. Now, a second problem that I will touch on here only briefly was the problem of social antagonism that was the result of rapid growth of capitalism. Before the middle of the 19th century, there was, of course, a good deal of commerce in Russia, but there wasn't a national grain market in rye and wheat and so on. It is only after the end of serfdom in 1861, and especially after the empire embarks on a very rapid set of railroad construction projects that created the basis of the modern Russian rail network. It is only after the railroads and the emancipation of serfdom that peasants, by and large, experience for the first time on their skin what it was like to live in a capitalist society. And in every capitalist order, there are winners and there are losers. But the point that I would like to make here is that there were insecurities. People were unfamiliar with the market. They win in one day, they lose in the next, and they resent individuals to whom they attribute their losses. So these antagonisms powerfully surface by the end of the 19th century. Now, in the cities, there is a situation that is comparable in a way to what happened in Europe in the middle of the 19th century. If you think about the dark satanic mills that Charles Dickens describes in his great novels, this was the sort of thing that happened in the cities in St. Petersburg and Moscow and elsewhere. The peripheries of the cities were dotted by ever larger factories. Because Russia was a latecomer to capitalist developments, these factories were of very large size. 5,000 or more workers were often working under the same roof. And this is politically significant because it was easier for these workers to feel that they were commonly exploited, and it was easier for those who preached a different gospel than that of Nicholas II, namely a gospel of social justice. It was easier for them to reach this great mass of people who felt themselves to be impoverished. And thus the wave of peasant violence and the wave of urban strikes that we have talked about earlier. So Russia was a Christian empire. It had laws and institutions that were designed to preserve order, but these laws and institutions were flawed. They did not preserve order, and indeed they could not.